Welcome, my name is Paul Morris and I'm a restoration ecologist. I have over 25 years of ecological restoration experience, and today I'm going to be talking about wetland restoration. So why do we want to create wetland habitats? Well, wetland habitats are important to all creatures because all creatures need water to thrive. And within a wetland, you've got all the food, you've got the habitat, you've got everything that the creature needs to live. And wetlands are important because they're basically the kidneys of the earth. You think of trees as being the lungs of the earth. Well, the wetlands are more like kidneys, where all the water and all the toxic chemicals that come off of the land go through a wetland, and the plants absorb all the nutrients, they pump oxygen down to the root system, and the bacteria in the subsoil, because they have that oxygen, they're breaking down all the toxic chemicals. So basically all that, the nutrients and all the toxicants that come off the land are broken down before they go into the ocean, before they go into the lake system, and along the river course. These things happen. So we need our kidneys. If we want to restore the planet, we need to restore the health of wetlands. It's also an important thing. So what I want to do is inspire you to create small wetlands and create very large wetlands. Even the smallest wetland is important for wildlife. Every species needs water to survive. And what we found is that putting a water feature on your property attracts up to 50% more species, because you're getting all these different wet species, plus you're getting your birds and your animals that are coming into that water feature, and you're increasing the diversity of your property. So I want to inspire you, and I'm going to show you different techniques to do that. I'm going to start off showing you some of the projects that I've done, and I'm going to show you some small projects, and I'm going to show you some much larger projects and how that all fits together as you gradually build your repertoire of different techniques. So why do we want to create habitat? Well, many species around the world are in decline, and habitat degradation and destruction is the main cause. So we want to restore these different species and return them to health, and how we do that is restoring our properties. So introducing native species into your property and restoring the land. Some of the species that are in decline, the photo that I'm showing is the ICUN example of some of the red areas are the species in decline. The yellow areas are species that are threatened, and the green species that are species that are not having as much trouble. Some of the species that are in decline worldwide are songbirds. So all over the place, songbirds are declining. And that's happening because of habitat destruction. Many of our songbirds migrate, and so they have to go through all these areas, and there's a lot of habitat that's missing now. In Canada, for example, we have a lot of agriculture that's taken over a lot of the land, and then they have to migrate for thousands of kilometers into Central America and South America, and all the way along there's a lot of habitat loss. Mammals are another area. Most of our large animals on the planet are in decline or threatened with destruction. Over 1 million species on the planet may go extinct within our lifetime. So you think about it, and it's like, how many species, especially the large species, are declining? And you think about all the predator species. Wherever humans go into an area, they kill off any sort of competition, anything that's going to threaten our livestock. We kill it. And so all these predator species are going to be in decline. And then if you look at them, these are our keystone species. They found in places like Yellowstone National Park. When they return the wolves to the ecosystem, the whole ecosystem starts to thrive again. So when you take off these key species, it's very important to put them back again. And the ecological restoration process is kind of, you're building from the ground up. It's a ground restoration, moving up into the higher species and creating the different habitats so that eventually the larger species can exist. Because without the lower trophic levels, you won't have an ecosystem that's healthy. So amphibians and reptiles are also species that are in decline worldwide. Amphibians are kind of the canary in the coal mine because they're absorbing everything through their skin. They breathe through their skin. So any sort of chemicals in the environment, any sort of diseases in there, and they'll start to decline. So they're declining worldwide. So pollinators are also in decline worldwide. Most of the species are declining, and a lot of the reason is diseases are moving around the planet, and we're introducing the non-native bees, the European honeybee, to almost every continent. And so we found studies that have shown that when you introduce the non-native European pollinators into an area, they take over and they push out the native pollinators. Also, we are using a lot of chemicals and a lot of species like neonicotinoids that are damaging to the pollinators. When they go and pollinate, they pick up the neonicotinoids and they take it back to the nest. So overall, we're getting the pollinators declining worldwide. And when that happens, we just have to think about all the species that we have, that we grow, all the vegetables, all the fruit, all those species that need pollination. What's going to happen when there's no pollinators? I mean, the European honeybee it can save us to one point, but originally it was all the native pollinators were pollinating all these species, and we're bringing in the European honeybee to replace the pollinators that we've lost and to increase the pollination in our crops, because we're doing them in monocultures. But we're also finding that the non-native species, the European honeybee, is declining. There's something called colony collapse disorder, and our beekeepers are losing half their hives every year. So it's a major problem. And so introducing the native pollinators back, the habitat for the pollinators back, is extremely important. Things like the monarch butterfly, which is kind of an icon, a symbol for the pollinators with its long migration. If you have that, then they migrate all the way down to Mexico, and so to maintain that population, you need to have habitats all the way along. And even you think you have a small property, or maybe it's just an urban property, but even having just that little postage stamp, it allows the pollinators to move from one spot to another and again, because they don't need a lot of habitat, but they need it all the way down. So why do we need to use native species? Well, the most important thing is that biodiversity is declining around the world. Study after study is showing that. And so the native species that we have here and in any habitat that you have is keyed to the native species, the wildlife, the pollinators, the birds. They're all keyed together. They've co-evolved together for thousands of years. And when you introduce an exotic species that's not native to the area, the wildlife doesn't understand that. So it's not a habitat that's readily used, and the seed's not readily eaten because it doesn't taste the same. And so the species don't use them. So we use native species because we want to increase the biodiversity of our property, because we want to help wildlife, pollinators and birds, etc. And the reason we're using native species is because they're low maintenance. Because they're keyed to the habitat that we have here. You're using species that are already co-evolved and they've adapted to this climate. They're used to the moisture regime, they're used to the soil, and so they need less maintenance. They need much less pesticides, much less fertilizer. Many of the native species have very deep roots and they can find their own nutrients. And because it's very, very simply, all these things make it so that you have much less maintenance cost and you have a lot less time involved over time. And you're also going to be attracting all sorts of birds that are eating the seeds and using the nest for nesting habitat. You're going to be attracting butterflies to use it for pollination, bees. So you're attracting all these great species into your property, and you're also healing the planet. And that's what we're here to do. So here I'm talking about water gardens. So water gardens are like a mini wetland, a mini ecosystem, and it's actually really amazing what you can get within just a little water garden. We had 2 meter by 3 meter little wetland that we created beside our house. And within that, I drained it one day, and within that I found like snapping turtles, painted turtles, like multiple frogs, and all sorts of little fish, and all sorts of aquatic insects. So I mean, even just having a little tiny pond, you create this whole ecosystem. So there's two different types of water garden that I'm going to give examples of. So one is using plants in the pot, and the other type is using it so it's more like a wetland where you have substrate at the bottom of your pond. So this is an example of a more natural system that we use for one of our ponds. And you can see that we have, this is kind of a rudimentary example, but you have different layers in your pond. So you have a much deeper area that goes down to 3 feet, and you need it to go down to 3 feet in Canada especially, because we have the lakes freeze here. So when you have a small pond, you need to have it down to 3 feet. So at the bottom you have a bit of mud, and the turtles and the frogs and all the different creatures can live within that little bit of mud at the bottom of the pond, and so that they can overwinter. And then you have your next layer, which is about 18 inches or about 1.5 feet. And in that layer, you want different emergent species to happen. So the deeper 3 feet, you're putting in your water lilies, and you're putting in your deep water species, your allodia, your different pond weeds. And then at 1.5 feet, you're doing your emergent species. There's many species that exist at that level. And then at about 6 inches, you've got your wet meadow type species and species that need shallow water. So you have this kind of gradient going down into your pond that allows for a whole diversity of different species. So how we do this is we basically dig a hole, but instead of doing your typical water garden where it's just straight down and then a flat bottom, we're doing terracing on the side. And so you terrace it, and then you make a dip and then a little bit of a lip around the edge of the area. And when you put your liner in, you need to make sure that that lip is still there. And you put your mud, your soil back in, and so it creates like little pockets. So you've got a pocket at the bottom that's just 3 feet, and then you have your 1.5 foot, and then you have your 6-inch area so that the different species can exist. So here's an example of 3 different ponds that we did, and as you can see, these are the ones where we've actually grown into the soil in the bottom of the pond, and it allows for the plants to move around more naturally. They can grow a little more aggressively, and you might have to control them a little bit and move them around, but for the most part it creates a more natural ecosystem that naturally moves around. So this is an example of using pots in a water garden system. So basically you have the same levels, but instead of creating little trays, little troughs, you're just creating little shelves, and you actually put the plants in a pot, and then you put them on the different shelves, and you can use bricks in the bottom of the pond to regulate the depth of the different pots. And so that gives you the same sort of area where the plants can exist. And this is just an example of using pots. So you can see the pots, and they've got little bricks under them to raise them up to the water level, which is the ideal condition for the hibiscus that you can see there. And this is an example of using just a barrel. So we put a brick in the bottom to raise up the plants to the right height, and you've got all sorts of different species in there that you can add in there, and just lining the barrel with a piece of rubber so it holds water. And this is an example of a shallow water pond system. So this is what I was using for propagating my plants, and you really only need about 6 inches of water for a lot of different species. So you can put this on your balcony or whatever, and you can grow a lot of different species with this technique. So for a larger scale pond, you have the same principles as you do with a smaller pond. You want to have that kind of natural gradient so that you're getting your drier species up the top, and then gradually the wetter and wetter and wetter species until you get into your emergents and then into your submergent species. So when you look at a pond, you have different aspects of that pond. Some areas are going to be more windswept, so the wind is going to impact them more. Some areas are going to be sheltered more. So different species have different disturbance tolerances. They have different moisture tolerances, different depths of water. So all these different aspects affect what species you can put into the pond. And it gives you a different microhabitat, so you can create unique little features within your pond just by modifying these different habitat features. So this is a project that we did in Hyde Park, and it's a high profile spot inside the city of Toronto. So it's a couple acre wetland, and as you can see, we have the wildflower species on the edge of the pond, and then as you go down into the pond you get more emergent species, and then as you go down into the water you get more submergent species. And you can see that there's butterflies and there's pollinators on the edges of the pond, and in the middle of the pond there's a duck. So it's attracting all sorts of different wildlife to the project. So I want to show you how to do that and how to draw in all this wildlife. So this is an example of a property that I had, and you can see that it's 95 acres and there's different areas. There's wetlands, and here I can show you a more detailed map. So the blue areas are areas that are wetland that I've restored on the property, the yellow areas are prairie, and the green areas are woodland areas I restored. So some of these areas were already in forest already, so I'm just trying to complement them. So I'm just going to focus on the wetland areas today, and you can see there's a long stream that I restored, so restoring that stream was important. There's wet meadow areas that were restored, and there's also some swamp area that was restored. So this is an example of a wetland project that we did. So this was basically a field with a wet area, and what we did was we dug a 1 acre pond and we restored that area. So you can see here's the pond area. And then 3 years later, this is what you can see. So we restored all that pond, and so very quickly the pond restores itself. So once you put the plants in and you create the different zones, then you'll quickly establish that pond system. This is an example of a wet meadow system that we're doing. So we had a wet area at the back of the property, about 2 acres. And it was constantly wet, and the farmer would get his tractor stuck in there. And so we went in there and we restored the property, and we were doing a burn in one of the pictures, and we also added a water control structure so that we could increase the amount of water held onto the land. And this is what the property looks like 2 years later. So you can see there's all sorts of species have come in. There's sedges, there's rushes, there's all sorts of wildflower species, and they're all wet-loving species. They like having their feet wet. So this is some of the stream restoration work we did at the back of the property. So it had a dammed area that was a couple acres worth of pond, and what we did is we lowered the dam. Initially there was a standpipe on top of the pipe there, and we took 3 feet off and lowered it down. And what that did was open up the back half of the pond, and it became mud flat, and we did the restoration work on the back half, seeding the area and planting it. And then we took the stop out of the bottom of the project and of the dam, and we allowed the stream to open back up again and flow naturally. And because of that, we restored the initial section. The second section that we opened up was more easy to restore. This is what happens when you reduce the dam. So what happens is the sinuosity starts to return to the river, and then afterwards at the back half you can see that the vegetation is just taken off because you've opened up the lake and returned it back to a natural system. And so when we seeded it and we planted it, it's quickly returns and flourishes because most of the wetland species are very disturbance oriented, so they're used to being able to quickly colonize an area. So this is an example of a wet meadow restoration we did. We seeded this area with multiple times with the different seed that we had collected, and because it was a wet area, gradually that would restore itself. And we do periodic burning on it because behind there's some Scots pine that we're seeding into the area, and we wanted to keep it in a wet meadow, so the shrubby species we were trying to control, and so we would burn it periodically, and that would open up to allow the herbaceous species to thrive in that different area. So this is what the place looks like after we burned it. So in the summertime, all the species came up. So there's all sorts of wildlife in here. There's all sorts of wildflowers and all sorts of pollinators. And one of the amazing things is just going out into this area and just listening to the many sounds of the different creatures in the ecosystem. It's just thrumming with life. So most wet meadow and marsh plantings, you typically have a species composition of about 60 to 80% grassy species or graminoids, and the rest of the species are your wildflower species. So when you're planting them, you're typically doing them about 1.5 feet apart, about a 1/2 meter spacing, and if you have more invasive species in the area, usually tighten it up to 1 foot or 30 centimeters. And if you're on a budget, you can do things like doing pod plantings, which is more intensely planting one area so that it establishes itself and then leaving a bit of a spot and then planting another area. This allows areas for invasive species to come in, but if you're on a budget, that allows you to plant more intensely and get more stability to those communities. So typically for plant spacing, we use about a 1/2 meter spacing. That's the most commonly used because the plants have enough time to expand within 1 year, and then they'll start intermeshing with each other. With more invasive species, we bring that down to about 30 centimeters, and then the more rapidly we have the spaces in between the plants are filled in. If you want more space, and for aquatic species, you can use like a 1 meter spacing, and that'll allow it to fill in quickly. But for shoreline, if you don't have the invasive species around, then it's fine to use more like a 1 meter spacing. It'll take a couple years for it to establish and fully integrate, but it'll still work. So when you're choosing plants, it's really important to use the most common species that are found within the ecosystem. Originally, those common species are going to be the species that create the ecosystem and to modify the ecosystem to be beneficial in the future for the rarer species coming in. So initially you're using the common species, and you also want to make sure that you're using species that are not dug from the wild, because you're damaging the ecosystem that's there. It's very easy to collect the seed and grow the plants up. And also when you collect species from the wild, most of the species are clonal, so you're actually grabbing multiple pieces of the same plant, and so you have reduced genetic diversity. So you want to have the maximum genetic diversity so you have the maximum resilience to the ecosystem. Also, you want to don't use the aggressive species, the non-native species that are exotic to the area. They're much more aggressive and they'll take over your community, and you'll have to deal with them later on. So I talked about the different levels in the ponds and the different gradients that allow different plants to grow. So let's take a look at some of the plants that are growing in those different depths. So we'll start out with the deep water species. That's going down 1 to 2 meters into the pond, and they're stopped basically beyond 2 meters because the light attenuates, and so there's not enough light at the bottom of the pond for the plants to grow. So you can use that to have open spaces in the middle of your pond for swimming. But the aquatic species, the deeper water species, are really important for fish. This is the fish habitat that you're trying to create for spawning, for growing them, and they have all sorts of aquatic insects associated with them that are the fish eat. So I mean, it's really important habitat, and it's also producing a lot of oxygen in the water. These are the plants that oxygenate the water. So you have your different pondweeds, you have your water lilies, you have different things that are out there, as well as species that just float on the top, like duckweeds. So this is how we do submergent planting. So you can see she has a water lily in her hand, and she's putting in the aquatic species into the pond. So this is about 4 degrees early spring, and she's one of our tough volunteers getting in there. But we found much better ways to do this, the installation of our submergent species now. So basically the best way to do it is taking a clay ball, taking some good stiff blue clay, and basically you make a little mud patty, and then you put your aquatic species on top of it, and then just roll, make it nice and tight, and then throw it into the pond, which is much simpler. And usually after you do the planting, you walk around the edge, make sure none of your plants have popped up. So then as you move down or a little bit further up onto the shoreline, we're talking between 30 centimeters and 1 meter water depth now. You have your emergent species, and these species are really important for species like ducks. They really need them for their aquatic habitat, but then they also produce a lot of seed. They're producing a lot of different nuts and different seeds that the birds really love. And so you have all these different species. You have a huge diversity of different emergent species, and they're growing, and what they do is they actually bring oxygen down into the root system, and they allow other species, the bacteria and fungus that are in the water, in the soil, they thrive, they break down the toxic chemicals, and they also pumping all that oxygen up and down through their system. So it really makes the ecosystem thrive. It's habitat for birds, it's habitats for insects. So this is a really important zone as well. So then we have a little bit further up the shore, the shallow emergent. So they're growing from basically the water line down to about 30 centimeters of water. And so you have all sorts of shallow water emergents in there. You've got your water plantains, and you have Acorus and all these sort of species that really love the shallow and just having wet feet. But then most of the plant is still above water. So this allows all sorts of insects again, and you have all sorts of different bird species love them. They produce a lot of seed. Some of the Biden species produce a ton of seed. So just having these different zones gives you added diversity and more species that you can add into the ecosystem, which is really important. We want to maximize our diversity of species. We want to maximize the resilience of the community. So when a disturbance comes along, the disturbance species will get in there quickly, and then over time it'll slowly succeed to other species. So you need that full range of species to make a good habitat. So the next area is the moist areas. So that is the area where it goes from the water line up to about 50 centimeters elevation, where the water can wick up into that soil, so it makes it nice and moist still. And these species are suited to that. And so you've got all sorts of sedges and rushes that can grow into that, but you've got a lot of different wildflowers that can grow. You have Joe Pye weed and your asters, your goldenrods, some things that are really nice like cardinal flower, and your different irises. So you've got a whole variety of different species, and it's just adding more and more biodiversity to the different site, having that gradient, and every stage you've got a whole slew of different species that you can add. And because it's in such a small area with such a tight gradient, you can get so many different species. This is why wetlands are so rich in biodiversity. They're one of the biodiversity hotspots. Understanding the different habitat types is really important. So the different aspects of the land, the soil characteristic, the light levels, the gradients, so all these different aspects, they really play an important role in determining which species you have. The disturbance regime, the flood frequency, all of these things. And when you're creating your habitat, you need to know that, and then you can decide which species are going in which location around your pond. And one of the important things that you need to do is have proper site preparation. Because if you don't have proper site preparation, then you're going to have a lot of problems with invasive species. So you want to control these right at the beginning, so that it gives an opportunity for the native species to establish themselves fully before they have to deal with the pressure of non-native species. So the optimal planting time for most plantings is the early spring, so planting up until about June in Canada. In your country might be slightly different because in July and August we have less rain, so we don't typically plant in that season, and then again in September to October you can plant again. So you have to work with the different seasons, the rainy season, the dry season, so understanding when is the best time to plant your plants. Typically, if you plant in the fall and the winter in Canada, you're more likely to have a chance of what's called frost heaving. So the soil freezes and pushes your plants out of the soil. And if the plants don't have enough time to root into the soil, then they actually just pop out of the ground. I mentioned this before, but invasive species are really important because they can you can have a really great ecosystem, or you can have a very degraded ecosystem very quickly once invasive species take over. Things like Phragmites, reed canary grass, these different things establish themselves very rapidly, or very tall and dominate. So you want to make sure those are eliminated from the system before you establish your native plants in there, and if they do become established from another area, you need to eliminate them very quickly. or else you'll have an invasive species stand rather than a native species stand. So just consider that, and don't put those species into your mix. There's like irises and different things you can get from the garden store that aren't native, and they cause problems in the ecosystem. The native species, don't utilize them, and they cause problems for them in the long run. So maintenance and long-term monitoring is really important. If you want to maintain the ecosystem, you need to get in there, remove the exotic species. Maybe you need in the first year to do some watering if your water levels drop, controlling your water levels to make sure it's optimal for the plants to grow, weeding if some areas don't work very well, replanting, things like erosion control in areas where there's high water movement and erosion can happen. So just doing all these different things and making sure that the ecosystem is tweaked into the right direction, and in 1 to 3 years you'll have a fully functioning ecosystem as the ecosystem binds together fully, and it'll be able to be much more strong and not have the exotic species places or holes in the ecosystem that exotic species can get into. So in conclusion, to summarize, we have many different things that we can talk about here. This is kind of a basic introduction to wetland restoration. We can get into stream restoration, we can get into dam removals, we can get into marsh restoration and mangrove restoration. But this is kind of giving you the basic feel of what needs to be done and how you can do it. So to summarize, we want to use native plants, and we want to use as much diversity of species as we can, so we have resilience within the community, so that when a disturbance, a disease, whatever it is comes in, that we have genetic diversity and we have species diversity. And so we want to be able to attract all the birds, the butterflies, the dragonflies, amphibians, reptiles. All these species are going to use this habitat. So just by putting a biodiversity of species in the plants, you're going to be attracting more species of wildlife. The other point is having a diversity of water regimes, so having different aspects, having different light levels, having different water levels. So just when you're designing your project, just creating as much habitat diversity before you put your plants in makes it so that you have a greater diversity in the long run. So they have all these different micro niches within the habitat, so the different species can thrive, and you have more species and more diversity, and we heal the planet. So the importance of wetlands is that they are feeding grounds. They're biodiversity hotspots. They rival even tropical forests in terms of biodiversity, because all the nutrients from the land come down and they feed these wetland ecosystems, and they're sucking up all the nutrients from the water and cleaning it before it's released into a lake or into an ocean. And so there's so many species they're just thriving, full of insects and fish and birds. And so you have all these birds that are migrating. So what happens when you remove a wetland is they have no place to go. I mean, imagine yourself driving along. You're going for the winter, you have to drive thousands of kilometers. Imagine going without food, without a rest, for thousands of kilometers. I don't think you could do it. And if you expect birds to do that, then maybe it's not going to work out. So we really need these spots all along coastlines, everywhere. Just having these little rest spots where birds have water. Even we're going to talk about creating little ponds for wildlife. I mean, just having a little bowl of water even for the birds in the summertime, it's essential, because we've drained all these wetlands, and so the birds and the wildlife just don't have a source of water anymore. So creating wetlands, creating small wetlands, creating large, huge wetlands, restoring them to health. They're the kidneys of the earth. They also produce tons of oxygen, suck down tons of carbon dioxide. These are carbon sinks. So we need to restore our wetlands. So many have disappeared. I mean, everybody looks at a wetland and they think they're garbage. We'll drain it, we'll develop it. It's got nice, rich, dark soil. That's all the carbon that you've got there, so we're going to drain it and we're going to use it for agricultural land. You keep doing that again and again and again, and well, suddenly your water is going straight into the ocean and causing problems there. Straight into lakes and causing algae blooms like in Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. So, you have to think about these things. We need wetlands. We need more wetlands. The planet needs the diversity. The planet needs the carbon pulled out of the atmosphere. The wildlife needs wetlands. So consider creating one. I just want to thank everybody for coming and enjoying this video. I'd like to teach many things about living in harmony with the planet. As an ecological restorationist, I'll teach about that. I'm going to talk about ecological agriculture. I'm going to talk about propagation of native plants. All these things are about living in harmony with the planet. We've taken it too far in one direction, and we gradually need to reintroduce these species back, reintroduce these habitats back. And I'm happy to show you how to do that and share all my knowledge from decades of doing this. And because it is a passion of mine, and I really want to share that with everybody so that everybody knows the different techniques, and so we have hope that the future, we want to live in a Garden of Eden. We don't want to live in a degraded ecosystem. We can do it. There's many things that we can do, and I'm going to talk about all these things. We're going to go some different places and show you what's happening. And I hope you enjoy that and join me on that journey. I'll leave all the information for my different social media platforms, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask those and I'll respond to you. Let's all work together and we'll create a better planet together. Thank you.